The desert sun was a merciless bronze eye, and under its gaze, Elara Vance felt the dust of Salvation Springs settle into the pores of her soul. At 22, she was the town's unofficial medic, her dreams of formal medical school in the East, buried alongside her mother in the hard, red earth. Now, her world was the mission clinic, the endless line of miners with coughs and the weight of her father's expectations. Reverend Josiah Vance believed in order, in scripture, in the slow, careful tending of one's soul. Elara, her hands stained with iodine and dirt, believed in the tangible. A set bone, a stitched wound, a fever broken. The day the stranger rode in, the town dogs fell silent first. He was a discordant note in the familiar symphony of the outpost. He moved with a predator's grace that the dusty miners and traders lacked, his presence carving a silence through the bustling street. His name was a whisper that snaked through the crowd before he even dismounted. Kaelen Rourke, the wraith of the Red Canyon. A prospector who answered to no law but the desert's own. Elara stood on the mission porch, a roll of bandages in her hand, watching him. Her father had preached just that morning about the serpents in the garden, men who offered a false freedom that was merely a different kind of cage. But he had never described the way such a man could make the very air hum, how his gaze, the color of a gathering storm, could feel like a physical touch. Kaelen dismounted, his boots kicking up puffs of red dust. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a worn leather duster. Every line of his body spoke of a raw, self-sufficient strength. His eyes, that startling storm gray, found hers across the distance, and Elara felt a jolt, like touching a live wire. It was a shock of pure, undiluted life. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat, a slow, deliberate gesture that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. Elara's grip on the bandages faltered. The roll slipped from her fingers, unraveling as it tumbled down the porch steps and into the dust. Heat flooded her cheeks. She, the Reverend's unflappable daughter, had been reduced to a flustered girl by a mere glance. But Kaelen didn't smile. He didn't mock. He simply walked to the base of the steps, crouched, and began winding the stray bandage back onto the roll with an efficient, almost clinical precision. His hands were large, scarred, and capable, yet they handled the white cloth with surprising gentleness. "Clumsy," he stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden planks beneath her feet. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. "The sun was in my eyes," she deflected, her voice tighter than she intended. He finished with the bandage and stood, holding it out to her. "The desert sun is always in your eyes. You learn to see past it." He was closer now, and she caught the scent of him. Leather, cold sage, and something else. Something wild and untamed. "Kaelen Rourke?" "Elara Vance," she said, taking the bandage. Her fingers brushed his. The contact was brief, but it sent a bolt of sensation straight up her arm. "My father is the Reverend, if you're seeking spiritual guidance." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not my soul that needs tending, Miss Vance, but I've a gash on my side that says otherwise. I was told you're the one to see." Before she could answer, her father's voice, cold and sharp, cut from the doorway. "Elara, inside, now." She turned to see Reverend Vance standing there, his face a mask of stern disapproval. The warmth of the moment shattered. That night, the argument in her parents' room was a low, furious hum through the wall. "A known quantity, Josiah," her mother, Constance, hissed. "The stories from Copper Ridge, from Adobe Flats. He's a brawler, a drifter. They say he's found a silver seam that's cursed, that men have died for it. And the women, he ruins them, leaves them haunted, searching for a feeling they can never find again with a decent man." "Constance, we do not traffic in gossip," her father's voice replied, weary and strained. "This is more than gossip. It's a pattern. They say he's built differently, that he shows a woman a glimpse of heaven and leaves her in a private hell. He is everything we have raised her against." Elara pressed her palms to her ears, but the words were already inside her, taking root. Built differently, haunted, a private hell. What kind of power could do that? It wasn't about charm or money. It was something deeper, something primal and physical. A dangerous, terrifying curiosity began to bloom within her, a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. The next morning, her father summoned her to his study. The air was thick with the smell of old leather and piety. "Daughter," he began, his hand steepled on the worn Bible. "This man, Rourke, he is a force of nature, and like a desert storm, he will pass, leaving only debris. You are not to treat him. You are not to speak to him. Do you understand?" "What did he do to those women, Father?" The question was out before she could stop it, a clinical, desperate need to understand. "How does one man ruin so many?" Reverend Vance's face tightened. He chose his words with obvious difficulty. "He awakens a hunger, Elara, a physical hunger that transcends the sanctity of the marital bed. They say his proportions are overwhelming. That once a woman has been with such a man, she is forever dissatisfied. She becomes a slave to the memory of a sensation. It is a form of madness." Elara's mind reeled. She was a student of science. She understood the mechanics of intimacy. But her father was speaking of something else entirely, a transformative, almost mystical power rooted in pure, exaggerated physicality. The clinical part of her was skeptical, but the lonely, yearning woman she kept hidden was utterly captivated. 3 days later, she found him waiting outside the clinic at dusk. He was leaning against the hitching post, a shadow against the dying light. "Your father's orders?" Kaelen asked, nodding toward the closed clinic door. "He's protective," Elara said, her key trembling slightly in the lock. "Of your reputation or of you?" "Is there a difference?" "Always." He straightened, and she saw the dark stain on his shirt, just above his hip. "The wound's festering. I can do most things myself, but this... I need a second pair of hands." It was a test. She knew it. To let him in was to defy her father, to step into the current of the gossip that surrounded this man. But to turn away a patient in need went against every oath she'd ever made to herself. She pushed the door open. "Inside. Be quick." The clinic was a small, stark room smelling of carbolic acid and dried herbs. She lit a lamp, the flame casting dancing shadows. "Take off your shirt and sit on the table." He did so without hesitation, shrugging out of the duster and then the linen shirt. Elara's breath caught. His back was a canvas of old scars and hard-earned muscle, but it was the wound on his side that drew her professional eye. A deep, angry gash, red and swollen at the edges. "This needs to be cleaned and stitched. It should have been done days ago," she said, her voice adopting the cool, detached tone she used with all her patients. "Wasn't near a pretty doctor then," he grunted as she began to clean the wound with antiseptic. He didn't flinch. She worked in silence, her fingers steady despite the proximity of him. His body heat was a furnace. She was acutely aware of the sheer scale of him, the width of his shoulders, the powerful cord of muscle in his neck. She understood now what the whispers meant. It wasn't just about one specific part. It was the totality of him, the overwhelming, primal masculinity that seemed to suck all the air from the room. "Why are you really here in Salvation Springs?" she asked, focusing on the suture needle. "Silver," he said simply. "The mother lode. It's here. I can feel it." "And then? You'll stake your claim, build a house, settle down?" His stormy eyes met hers, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "You've been listening to the stories, Miss Vance, the ones that say I don't know how to stay." Elara tied off the last stitch and cut the thread. "All done. Try to keep it clean." She turned to put her instruments away, but his hand closed around her wrist. His grip wasn't harsh, but it was absolute. It sent that same electric jolt through her system, paralyzing and exhilarating. "You didn't answer my question," he said, his voice low. "Do you believe the stories? Do you think I'm the devil your father says I am?" Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. "I think a man is defined by his actions. not the whispers of others. Then watch my actions, he murmured, his thumb stroking the delicate skin of her inner wrist. I'm going to find that silver. And when I do, I'm going to build a house that doesn't feel like a cage. And I'm going to need a partner who isn't afraid to get her hands dirty. He released her, stood, and pulled his shirt back on. He left a handful of coins on the table, too much for the service, and paused at the door. Think on it, Elara Vance. A life of patching up miners in this dust bowl, or a life of building something new. With me. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the lamplight, the phantom heat of his touch still burning on her wrist, the scent of leather and wildness clinging to the air. The choice, terrifying and exhilarating, had been laid at her feet. The days after Kaelen Rourke left the clinic stretched into a week, each one longer and more suffocating than the last. Salvation Springs felt smaller, the dust drier, the complaints of the miners more tedious. Elara moved through her duties, changing dressings, mixing tonics, reading to the children at the mission, with a mind that was miles away, tracing the contours of the Red Canyon. Her father's sermons on temptation felt pointed, his gaze heavy on her during Sunday service. Her mother watched her with a new, nervous intensity, as if expecting her to vanish in a puff of smoke and scandal at any moment. The town's whispers had found a new subject, the Reverend's daughter and the Wraith. She heard the fragments, saw him leaving her clinic after dark. Think she can tame a man like that? And felt their heat on her neck, but she kept her chin high. Let them talk. She had done her job. It was on a market day, while she was bartering for medical supplies, that she felt his presence before she saw him. The air shifted, the crowd's murmur dying down. She turned, and there he was, standing by the dry goods store, his eyes locked on her. He didn't approach, just gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod toward the northern edge of town, where the desert began its raw, unbroken stretch. Then he turned and melted into the crowd. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was not an invitation, it was a summons, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled and thrilled her, that if she did not go, he would never ask again. This was her only chance to see what lay beyond the cage of her life. She told her mother she was going to gather specific healing herbs that only grew in the rocky foothills, a lie that felt foreign and slick on her tongue. Her mother's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Elara rode her mare, Juno, out of town, the stares of the townspeople like physical weights on her back. Once she passed the last crumbling adobe wall, she urged the horse into a canter, the wind whipping loose strands of hair from her braid. The freedom was terrifying. He was waiting where the trail split, a dark silhouette against the vast ochre expanse of the canyon. He sat atop his stallion, still as the rock itself. When she drew near, he didn't smile. You came. I'm here, she corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. Show me why. Without another word, he turned his horse and led her down a narrow, treacherous path she would never have found on her own. They rode for an hour in silence, the only sounds the crunch of hooves on gravel and the cry of a distant hawk. The canyon walls rose around them, layered in bands of red and gold, a cathedral of stone. He finally stopped in a secluded box canyon, hidden from the world. A small spring fed a patch of stubborn green, and the air was cool and still. He dismounted and turned to face her, the storm in his eyes now a quiet intensity. You asked why I'm here, he said. This is why. He led her to a fissure in the rock wall, barely wide enough for a man to slip through. Inside, the space opened up. He struck a match, and the flame caught on a lantern wick. The light bloomed, and Elara's breath caught in her throat. The walls weren't just rock. They were veined with a thick, gleaming ribbon of silver, so pure it seemed to glow with its own light. It was a fortune, a king's ransom, shining in the lantern's humble glow. My God, she whispered, the sound swallowed by the stone. It's not a curse, Kaelen said, his voice echoing softly. It's a claim, my claim. But a claim is just rock until you build something on it. He set the lantern down and turned to her, his large frame dominating the cavern. The stories about me. Some are true. I've fought. I've wandered. I've left women who wanted more than I could give at the time. He took a step closer. The part about me being built a certain way, that's true too. Elara's mouth went dry. This was the moment the whispers had warned her about, the clinical curiosity ward with a surge of primal fear. "Are you trying to scare me away?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I'm trying to be honest. The women in those towns weren't ruined by a feeling. They were ruined by the lack of it afterward. They wanted a lifetime of what I could only offer for a season. I'm not that man anymore." He gestured to the silver around them. "This changes everything. This is a foundation, but a foundation needs a cornerstone." He moved so quickly she had no time to react. One moment he was feet away, the next he was right before her, his hands coming up to frame her face. They were rough and warm, holding her with an astonishing gentleness. "You're not like them, Elara. You're not looking for a temporary thrill. You're looking for a purpose. So am I. Let me show you what that purpose could feel like." He didn't kiss her. He simply looked at her, his gaze stripping away every pretense, every lesson, every fear, until all that was left was the raw, yearning truth of her. She saw the promise in his eyes, not just of wealth, but of a life lived on her own terms, a partnership of equals, a life where her hands could build instead of just mend. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head. His lips met hers. It was not a gentle courtship kiss. It was a claiming. It was the desert sun and the canyon wind. It was hunger and promise, and a terrifying, exhilarating sense of coming home. Her hands came up, not to push him away, but to clutch at the front of his shirt, anchoring herself as the world tilted. She felt the hard, unyielding strength of him, the sheer scale of his presence, and instead of being afraid, she felt a corresponding strength awaken within herself. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. The silver-lined cavern seemed to spin around them. "That's the truth of me," he said, his voice rough. "That's the man who wants to build a life with you, not the wraith, not the story." Elara's mind was a whirlwind, but her heart was preternaturally calm. She understood now. The ruin wasn't the man, it was the memory of a possibility so vast it made every other life seem small. He was offering her that possibility, not as a fleeting season, but as a lifetime. "My father will never allow it," she said, the practical reality crashing back in. Kaelen's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking for his permission. I'm asking for your decision. Meet me here tomorrow at dawn. Come with nothing. We'll ride to Silverton and be married by sundown. Or don't. And I'll ride out of this canyon, and you'll never see me again." He picked up the lantern and walked out of the cavern, leaving her alone in the dark with the ghost of his kiss and the weight of a decision that would define her forever. She rode back to Salvation Springs as the sun bled into the horizon, the taste of him still on her lips, the image of the silver seared behind her eyes. The town, with its judgment and its dust, felt like a dream from which she was finally waking up. She knew what she had to do. The house was silent, a vessel of sleeping piety. Elara moved through the darkness of her room not as a ghost, but as a surgeon preparing for a final, necessary operation. She left the medical texts, the modest dresses, the life of Elara Vance neatly folded on her bed. In a small leather satchel, she packed only practical trousers, a spare shirt, her kit of medicines, and the heavy weight of her decision. She did not leave a note. Words would be useless weapons for them to wield against her memory. Let her absence be her only statement. Slipping out the back window, the cool night air felt like her first true breath. Juno, saddled and waiting in the copse of trees behind the mission, snorted softly in greeting. Elara mounted, gave the sleeping town one last, unflinching look, and turned the horse's head toward the canyon. Kaelen was exactly where he said he would be, a silhouette against the nascent gray of pre-dawn. He didn't speak as she approached, simply nodded, his stormy eyes reading the resolve in her face. He turned his stallion, and they rode north, leaving Salvation Springs to its dust and its judgments. The ride to Silverton was a journey into a new world. The landscape grew wilder, the air sharper. They spoke little, the understanding between them too profound for chatter. He pointed out plants she could use for poultices, showed her how to find water in dry riverbeds. It wasn't courtship, it was partnership, and with every mile, the last chains of her old life fell away. In Silverton, a bustling, raw-edged mining town, they found a justice of the peace. The ceremony was swift, devoid of scripture or hymn. When Kaelen slid a simple, heavy silver band onto her finger, forged from his own claim, the finality of it was not a cage door closing, but a gate swinging open. "With this ring, I pledge my claim to you," he said, his voice low and sure, "as you pledge yours to me." That night, in a small rented room above a noisy saloon, the theoretical became real. The lantern was lit, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the scent of pine and anticipation. Kaelen stood before her, not as the legendary wraith, but as a man, his expression uncharacteristically solemn. "There are no stories here, Elara, just you and me. This will be a process. Your body is not made for mine, not yet." He was painstakingly patient. His hands, so capable of violence and extraction, were instruments of exquisite gentleness. He taught her the geography of his scars, and in turn learned the landscape of her fears and her burgeoning courage. There was pain, a sharp, shocking stretch that made her gasp and her eyes water. But he stopped, held perfectly still, his forehead damp against hers. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice strained with the effort of his own control. "Just breathe through it. You set bones. You can do this." And she could, because it was him, because he was not taking, but giving. When her body finally, miraculously, adjusted to the overwhelming fullness, when the pain receded and transformed into a feeling of profound, shocking completion, she understood. This was not being ruined. This was being remade. Their life in the canyon was one of shared labor. Elara traded her clinic for a canvas tent, then helped Kaelen and the few men he trusted to raise the timber frames of a sturdy cabin. She used her knowledge to treat the minor injuries of the work crew, earning a quiet respect that had nothing to do with her being a woman or a wife. Weeks turned into a month. One evening, as the sun set the canyon walls on fire, she saw a lone rider picking his way down the trail. Her breath hitched. It was her father. Reverend Josiah Vance dismounted, his posture rigid, his face aged a decade. He looked past the half-built cabin, the silver-laden rock, and directly at his daughter. She stood, not in front of Kaelen, but beside him. "Father," she said, her voice calm. "Elara." His gaze swept over her, her sun-touched skin, her work-roughened hands, that simple, unadorned strength in her posture. He saw the silver band on her finger. "I came to bring you home. I am home." His composure cracked. "This is not a home. This is a prospector's camp, a fantasy. He has bewitched you. Has he—" He couldn't finish, his face a mask of anguish and disgust. "Has he used that unnatural gift of his to trap you here?" Kaelen took a half-step forward, his presence a protective wall, but Elara laid a hand on his arm, stopping him. This was her battle. "He has given me nothing but respect, Father," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the canyon air. "And a choice. You warned me he would show me a glimpse of heaven and leave me in hell. You were wrong. He didn't show me a glimpse. He gave me the tools to build my own." She gestured to the foundation of the cabin, the mine entrance, the vast, wild beauty of the land. "You taught me to tend to broken things. He showed me I could build something that wouldn't break. You wanted to protect my soul by keeping it in a small, safe box. He asked my soul to grow large enough to fill this entire canyon." Reverend Vance stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He did not see a ruined woman, a hollowed-out victim of sin. He saw a founder, a partner, a woman standing on her own land, beside her own man, unbroken and utterly complete. The fight drained out of him. The rigid set of his shoulders slumped. His gaze shifted from his daughter to Kaelen. "You married her?" "Before God and the law," Kaelen said, his tone respectful but firm. "My claim is legal. My wife is my equal in it." There was a long, heavy silence. The Reverend looked at the raw, honest work of their hands, at the steadfast way Kaelen stood beside his daughter, not in front of her. He saw the truth his wife's gossip had blinded him to. This was not a man who destroyed. He was a man who built, and he had built something strong and real in Elara. He looked back at his daughter, and a profound, weary acceptance settled in his eyes. "You are—" "Well?" he asked, the question encompassing everything. "I have never been better," Elara replied, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. He nodded slowly, turned, and remounted his horse. He looked down at them, a strange blend of loss and dawning pride on his face. "Then, your mother and I, we will pray for your endeavor." It was not a blessing, but it was a truce, a recognition. As he rode away, Elara felt a final, quiet piece of her old life settle into place, not as a chain, but as a foundation stone. Years later, the Vance Rourke claim was the most prosperous in the territory. The cabin was now a sprawling ranch house, its windows looking out over the canyon Elara had come to love more than any street or steeple. Their son, a sturdy boy with his father's stormy eyes and his mother's steady hands, played near the corral. Elara, her body softened and strengthened by motherhood and hard work, watched from the porch, a letter from her mother in her hand, an invitation for a visit, an acceptance that had been a long time coming. Kaelen came to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist, his chin resting on her head. His presence was as solid and enduring as the silver in their mountain. "You ever think about it?" he murmured, his voice a familiar rumble against her back. "The mission, the dust, the life you left?" Elara leaned back into his strength, watching their son chase a lizard across the warm stones. She thought of the clinic, not with regret, but with the quiet knowledge that she had traded patching up the world for building her own small, perfect corner of it. "I didn't leave a life, Kaelen," she said, turning in his arms to look up at him, her eyes clear and sure. "I arrived at one." In his gaze, she saw the reflection of the woman she had become, not the preacher's daughter, not the wraith's woman, but Elara Rourke, partner, builder, healer, found, and it was more than enough.